Hi all. This is a story about how my dad got remarried and kicked me out of the house because I was a reminder of his past, a part of his life he wanted to forget. I'm 17 now, nearly 18, but this all started about a year ago when my mom left us. My mom had been having an affair for almost 2 years with someone she knew from high school. Eventually, they decided to make it official. She left, ran off with him for a couple of weeks, and was ready to marry him when she had a change of heart. She came back saying she wanted to do things the right way, so she filed for divorce. When it was finalized, she cut off all contact, moving to Europe with her new husband and leaving me with my dad. Living with my dad wasn't exactly a relief. He didn't get along with me even before my mum left. But after the divorce, it was like he outright hated me. He blamed me for being a constant reminder of the marriage that ended badly and of the life that had humiliated him. My parents had always been big on reputation, how they looked to other people, and keeping up appearances. As long as they were together, they kept me around to look like a complete family to others. But things were different now. For most of my life, my parents raised me in a way that seemed fine on the outside. I had clothes, a comfortable home, and all the basic needs. But behind closed doors, it was all about keeping up a perfect image. They never really cared about me. I was just a part of their facade. I was forbidden to talk to anyone about what went on at home, how I was treated, or the fact that I barely had a relationship with my parents. They made it clear that if I ever let anything slip, there would be consequences. And those threats worked. For years, I kept my mouth shut. But everything changed when my dad decided to remarry. He'd been dating his secretary after the divorce was finalized, and it wasn't long before they went public with the relationship. They got engaged a few months ago and were married a couple of weeks ago. I attended the wedding events, but only because he made me. My role was to smile and act like a happy kid who was thrilled for her dad. I played the part, pretending to be okay with this fresh start he wanted so badly. But the truth was, he didn't want me there. To him, I was just a reminder of the past, of the marriage he wanted to forget. A few days after the wedding, my dad and his new wife called me in for a talk. They told me that since they were married now, they didn't want me living with them anymore. They wanted a clean slate, a new beginning with no baggage. And to them, I was the baggage. My dad didn't even pretend to be sorry. He told me I had until the end of the week to pack my things and find somewhere else to go. I was turning 18 soon after all, and he thought it was high time. I learned to be independent. I tried to reason with them. I told them that I had nowhere else to go, no savings to my name. My dad had always refused to let me work, saying it would look bad if people saw me working when he could easily afford to provide for me. So I'd never had a chance to save up or prepare for this. I wasn't even sure how I would afford college. Even though I'd been accepted to a couple of schools, I still needed funds to secure my spot, and any student loan would require an adult co-signer, but they didn't care. My dad told me it was my problem now, and they both left me sitting in the living room, completely lost. I tried everything to get through to them. I reasoned, argued, and even broke down and begged, but it was no use. They were set on their decision and treated me like an unwanted stranger in the home I'd known all my life. For the first time, I knew I had no other choice. I had to speak up, even if it meant facing the consequences I'd been afraid of for years. After a night of thinking it over, I packed a few things, left the house, and went to my grandparents' place. These were my dad's parents, the only grandparents I'd known. My mum's parents had passed away when I was young, and my dad's parents had always been kind to me, though distant. I'd never told them anything about my life at home. I was too scared that my parents would retaliate if they found out. But now, I was out of options. I sat down with my grandparents and told them everything. The neglect, the expectations, the way my dad treated me like a stain on his perfect image. I explained that he was kicking me out because he didn't want me tainting his new life and that I had nowhere else to go. I half expected them to side with him. After all, they'd raised my dad, and he'd inherited a lot of their focus on reputation and appearances. But to my surprise, they were outraged. They couldn't believe my dad would do something so heartless. They told me that I didn't need to worry about anything. They'd take care of me and support me while I got back on my feet. My grandpa even assured me that I wouldn't have to stress about college or living expenses. He said I'd had enough anxiety for one lifetime and that from now on, they'd be there for me. In a single moment, I felt an enormous weight lift off my shoulders. I was finally safe, finally seen and cared for. I'd spent years believing that if I ever opened up, no one would care and that I'd be punished. And here were my grandparents telling me they'd support me unconditionally. For the first time, I felt like I had a real family. But that's not where it ended. My grandpa did something I never saw coming. He fired my dad from the family company. My dad had been set to take over the business that my great-grandfather had started and passed down through the generations. My grandpa had been gradually preparing to hand the reins to my dad, but after learning how he'd treated me, he wanted nothing to do with him. He even went so far as to revoke my dad's company housing and car, things my dad had only because of my grandpa's generosity. It was a huge, unceremonious fall from grace for my dad, and I heard later that he was threatening to sue my grandpa. But my grandpa didn't flinch. He had good cause to fire him, and he made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate my dad's threats. I later learned that my grandpa had seen signs that my dad wasn't cut out to run the company, and that my dad's position had always been shaky. But it was my story that sealed the deal. My grandpa decided that if his only son was capable of treating his child like this, he wasn't fit to carry on the family legacy. Since that day, I've been living with my grandparents, who have treated me with a kindness and warmth I'd never known at home. They told me they wished I'd come to them sooner, that if they'd known what was happening, they would have stepped in to protect me. I wish I'd known that too, but I was so afraid for so long that I didn't think I had any choice but to endure it. Now, my grandparents are fully supporting me, covering all my expenses, including college. For the first time, I don't have to live with constant worry about where my next meal will come from or how I'll afford school. I can focus on my life, on building a future, and not on surviving my past. I finally feel like I'm in a safe place, and I'm grateful every single day. Life with my grandparents felt like a completely different world. They'd brought me into their home with open arms, making it clear that I was now part of their family and that I didn't need to look back. I'd never been treated with such care and respect, and every day I was adjusting to the warmth and stability that was so foreign to me. A couple of days after I moved in, my grandparents went to my dad's house to pick up my things. They didn't tell him they were coming. They just showed up, packed up my stuff and left. They didn't want me anywhere near the place, so I stayed back at their house while they handled it. They told me later that my dad and his new wife tried to put up a front, pretending that nothing unusual was happening. But my grandparents weren't having any of it. They collected everything I needed and left without a word. In the weeks that followed, my grandpa made another big decision. He was going to officially fire my dad from the family company. My grandpa runs a well-known finance firm that my great-grandfather founded years ago, and it's always been the family's pride and legacy. My dad had joined the company a few years ago, and it was assumed he would eventually take over. But after hearing how he'd treated me, my grandpa decided my dad wasn't fit to lead the company. I'll admit, when I first heard about this, I felt guilty. For years, I'd been conditioned to believe that anything bad that happened in the family was somehow my fault. I even told my grandpa that he didn't need to do this on my account, but he shut that down immediately. He said my dad's treatment of me was just the last straw and that he'd been concerned about my dad's capabilities for a while. According to my grandpa, my dad wasn't very skilled in business. He'd relied heavily on my grandpa to keep things running smoothly. Now, my grandpa wasn't willing to hand the reins over to someone who couldn't handle the job and who lacked the integrity to lead. It wasn't long before my dad found out he was being fired, and the fallout was immediate. He started calling my grandparents, demanding to know why he was being let go. When he didn't get the answers he wanted, he went on a rampage, threatening to sue my grandpa for wrongful termination. My grandpa didn't seem fazed at all. He had the best legal team in place, and he knew that my dad didn't have much of a case. But that didn't stop my dad from pushing forward, trying to file a lawsuit against his own father. In the meantime, my dad kept texting me, blaming me for everything. He called me vindictive, cruel, and petty, accusing me of turning my grandparents against him out of spite. He even told me I was overreacting by leaving, as if being thrown out of my own home was no big deal. At first, his words got to me. I almost started believing that maybe I'd done something wrong by speaking up. But then, I remembered the years of neglect, the way I'd been treated as a burden, and I knew I had every right to leave. Eventually, I stopped reading his messages and began blocking his numbers. Each time he made a new account to reach out to me, I'd just block it again. I could tell he was getting desperate, and that's when he started sending guilt-tripping messages, saying things like, "I did my best as a father," and "You're just a spoiled brat for not appreciating what you had." But I'd finally reached a point where his words couldn't hurt me anymore. Living with my grandparents had shown me what real care and support looked like, and I knew I deserved better than what he'd given me. Things escalated when my grandpa decided to take back the company-owned house my dad was living in. As part of his job, my dad had been given a company home, a perk that came with the position, but now that he'd been fired, he had no right to stay there. My grandpa began the legal process to evict him, which only added fuel to my dad's anger. He had 4 weeks to find a new place, which was far more time than he'd given me. But of course, he still thought he was being treated unfairly. In the meantime, my grandma had been quietly working on buying the house from the company. She wanted to make sure my dad couldn't get his hands on it and planned to transfer it to my name. When my dad found out about this, he lost it completely. He sent me a long, angry message saying I was stealing everything he'd worked for and that I'd destroyed his life. He even accused me of plotting to take over his inheritance, as if I'd had any control over my grandparents' decisions. Once again, I felt a pang of guilt. The house, the inheritance, everything that had been set aside for him was suddenly being transferred to me. It felt surreal, and I wasn't sure how to process it. But my grandparents reassured me that they weren't doing this out of revenge. They just didn't believe my dad deserved those things anymore. My grandpa even told me that he'd spent years giving my dad chances to prove himself and that he'd always tried to help him succeed. But my dad's behavior toward me had crossed a line and he couldn't overlook it. Living with my grandparents during all of this was both strange and comforting. They shared a lot of the same values as my dad: punctuality, table manners, and a certain level of formality, but they were genuinely good people. They cared about me in a way my parents never had. My grandma would check in on me each day, making sure I was adjusting well, and my grandpa would take time to talk to me, something my dad had never bothered to do. For the first time, I felt like I had a family who genuinely cared. Through all of this, I couldn't help but think back on how different my life could have been if I'd spoken up sooner. My grandparents told me that if I'd come to them earlier, they would have taken me in right away. But the fear my parents instilled in me had kept me silent. I'd spent years believing that if I ever dared to tell anyone the truth, I'd be punished. And while it was a relief to finally be free of that fear, it was also bittersweet. I couldn't help but wonder if things would have turned out differently if I'd had the courage to reach out sooner. Despite everything, my dad continued his legal battle with my grandpa, refusing to back down. The lawsuit dragged on for weeks, but my grandpa's legal team was prepared. They had all the documentation they needed to prove my dad's incompetence in his role, and it didn't take long for the case to start leaning heavily in my grandpa's favor. Watching it all unfold, I realized just how deep my dad's sense of entitlement ran. He was willing to fight his own father, the man who'd supported him for years, rather than admit he was wrong. As the case neared its end, my dad made one last attempt to reach a settlement. He showed up at my grandparents' house unannounced, trying to persuade them to negotiate out of court. I happened to be the one who answered the door, but he barely even acknowledged me. He went straight to my grandparents, practically begging them to settle. My grandpa, however, refused. He reminded my dad that he'd been the one to file the lawsuit and that if he wanted to pursue it, he'd have to see it through. The conversation grew heated, with my dad accusing my grandparents of turning on him because of me. He even pointed at me, blaming me for everything that had happened. It was a surreal moment hearing him try to pin his failures on me, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I simply walked away, leaving him to face my grandparents alone. Eventually, my dad stormed out of the house, slamming the door on his way out. My grandparents came to my room afterward, reassuring me that I'd done the right thing by not engaging with him. They knew he was trying to manipulate the situation, but they also knew I was stronger than his words now. My grandpa told me that this was a long time coming, that my dad had always taken advantage of their kindness, and that it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. With the lawsuit heading toward a resolution, I finally felt a sense of closure. I knew my dad would never understand why I'd left or why I'd chosen to speak up, but I also knew I didn't need his understanding or approval. For the first time, I felt like I had a family who truly had my back, and I was ready to leave the past behind and move forward. After my dad's outburst at my grandparents' house, things felt different. I could tell he'd finally realized he was losing control, and that the family he thought would stand by him no matter what was choosing me instead. My grandpa had made it clear he wouldn't back down, and I felt a quiet pride in knowing that my grandparents were willing to stand up for me, even when it meant going against their own son. The lawsuit continued, but it became clear my dad was losing ground quickly. Every time he tried to argue that he'd been wrongfully terminated, my grandpa's lawyers would produce evidence of his poor performance, questionable decisions, and lack of accountability. The whole thing was almost surreal to watch unfold. My dad had always been the one to demand perfection from others, to put down anyone who fell short, and here he was being confronted with his own failures, and he had nowhere left to hide. One day, I overheard my grandparents talking about my dad's history with the company, and I learned things I'd never known before. Apparently, my grandpa had been bailing him out for years, quietly covering up mistakes, even funding failed business ventures to give my dad a chance to find his way. Each time my dad had promised to turn things around, but he never did. My grandpa had offered him the position at the family company as a final attempt to help him get on the right track, hoping he'd eventually be ready to take over. But he'd never taken the responsibility seriously, and now, after everything he'd done, my grandpa was done waiting for him to change. My dad must have sensed the end was near too, because he kept trying to contact me. He'd go on about how he was my real family, and that I had no right to turn everyone against him. He even tried to frame everything that was happening as my fault, saying that I'd ruined his reputation and his career. It was exhausting, and at times I'd catch myself doubting whether I'd done the right thing by telling my grandparents everything. But every time I'd think back to the years of neglect, the way he'd thrown me out like I was nothing, and I knew he was reaping what he'd sown. I stayed strong, blocking his new numbers whenever he tried to reach out. My grandparents told me I was doing the right thing, that I didn't owe him anything, and that they'd support me no matter what. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared for me and who were on my side. It was a new kind of strength I hadn't known before, and it made me realize just how much I'd missed growing up. As the lawsuit dragged on, word spread through the extended family about what was happening. I'd been so used to keeping my head down and avoiding attention that I was surprised when relatives started reaching out to me, checking in to see if I was okay. It turned out that once they knew the truth, many of them felt outraged on my behalf. They'd never known what went on behind closed doors, but now that everything was coming to light, they could see my dad's true colors. The support from relatives I hadn't even been close with before was overwhelming, and it showed me just how much my dad had isolated me with his rules and control. After a few months, the lawsuit finally came to an end. My grandpa won, and my dad had no choice but to give up. The terms of the case were kept private, but I knew my dad had lost a lot, and he was no longer welcome at the company. With the lawsuit out of the way, my grandma was finally able to finalize the purchase of the company house my dad had been living in. Now, the house was officially mine. I still couldn't believe it. The same home I'd been kicked out of, where I'd felt so unwanted and unloved, was now under my name. The irony wasn't lost on me, and while I had no intention of moving in, knowing I had a place to call my own felt like a powerful statement. that I had reclaimed the parts of my life he'd tried to control. Once my dad realized he was truly on his own, he tried one last desperate tactic. He showed up at my grandparents' house unannounced, again, demanding a meeting. This time, though, I knew I wasn't going to play into his hands. When I heard he was at the door, I went to my room, closing the door behind me. I knew he was hoping to manipulate me, to drag me back into his world of guilt and control, but I refused to give him that satisfaction. My grandparents handled it, calmly reminding him that his choices had led to this and that he was responsible for the outcome. From my room, I could hear the tension in his voice as he argued, trying to convince them to reconsider, to give him another chance. It was as if he'd finally realized the gravity of what he'd lost. But my grandparents were firm. They weren't going to be manipulated or guilt-tripped into helping him again. Eventually he left, slamming the door behind him, and I felt a strange mix of relief and finality. I knew that was the last time he'd try to involve me in his mess. With my dad finally out of the picture, I was able to focus on my future. My grandparents encouraged me to start planning for college, and they assured me they'd support me every step of the way. For the first time, I felt genuinely excited about the future. I'd spent so long worrying about how to escape my parents' control that I'd never let myself dream about what I really wanted. Now, I could finally start building the life I'd always hoped for, and my grandparents were right there beside me, cheering me on. As I prepared for college, I felt a sense of freedom I'd never known before. My dad's influence was no longer hanging over me, and I was finally surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. I was free to make my own choices and to explore my interests and passions without fear of judgment or punishment. I could finally start becoming the person I was meant to be, without the weight of my dad's expectations holding me back. Life with my grandparents was still a bit of an adjustment. They were supportive and caring, but they also had a certain formality that reminded me of my dad. There were rules about punctuality, proper manners, and maintaining appearances, but it felt different with them. They genuinely believed in these values, not just as a way to control me, but as a way to instill discipline and respect. They took the time to explain things to me, to teach me, and to make sure I understood the reasons behind their expectations. For the first time, I felt like part of a family, like I was being guided rather than ordered around. In the weeks leading up to my college move-in date, my grandparents and I spent a lot of time together, talking about my plans, my dreams, and my goals. They were proud of me, and they made sure I knew it. I realized how much I'd missed growing up. Simple things like family dinners, conversations about my future, even just having someone who cared enough to ask about my day. These were things I'd never known with my parents, and now I was finally experiencing the love and support I'd always longed for. As the day approached, I felt both excited and nervous. This was the first big step toward a future I'd built on my own terms, and while there was still a part of me that feared the unknown, I knew I was ready. I was stronger than I'd ever been, thanks to my grandparents and the support of the family I'd never thought I could rely on. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I finally had the confidence to face them. When I left for college, my grandparents hugged me tightly, promising to visit and reminding me that I always had a home with them. For the first time, I believed it. I knew they meant it, that I was truly part of their family. And as I walked onto campus, ready to start this new chapter of my life, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the support, the love, and the chance to finally, truly be myself. Moving to college felt like a breath of fresh air. I was on my own for the first time, surrounded by people my age, all figuring out their lives and navigating the challenges of independence. The excitement was contagious, and I found myself adjusting quickly to campus life. I was determined to make the most of this new chapter, and knowing I had the support of my grandparents gave me the confidence to dive in headfirst. My first semester went by in a blur of classes, new friendships, and late-night study sessions. It was challenging but fulfilling, and I started to feel like I was finally building a life that was mine alone. For the first time, I could focus on my interests without any pressure from my past. I joined a few clubs, started working part-time at the campus library, and even found a mentor who helped me explore career paths. Life was good. I kept in close touch with my grandparents, calling them every few days to share updates. They were always thrilled to hear from me, asking about my classes, my friends, and how I was adjusting. They told me how proud they were, and their encouragement made me feel like I was truly moving in the right direction. I even started making plans to visit them over winter break, eager to share all my stories and see them again. But as the months went by, my dad started creeping back into my life in subtle ways. He hadn't reached out to me directly since our last encounter, but I began hearing about him through the grapevine. Some relatives mentioned he'd rented a small apartment and was trying to get back on his feet, picking up odd jobs and networking to build some kind of independent career. Part of me felt a tiny flicker of relief that he seemed to be moving on, but I couldn't shake the sense that he hadn't fully let go. Then, a week before finals, I got a call from my cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. She sounded hesitant, but eventually got to the point. My dad had been trying to get in touch with me through her. Apparently, he was reaching out to family members, asking them to help him reconnect with me. She'd felt uneasy about it, sensing that I might not want contact, so she called to give me a heads up. I thanked her and told her I appreciated her honesty, then asked her to keep my distance if he reached out again. The timing couldn't have been worse. Finals were around the corner and my focus was already stretched thin. But even as I tried to push the thought of him away, he lingered in the back of my mind, his attempts to insert himself back into my life stirring up old feelings of anger and guilt. I kept reminding myself that I'd made the right decision and that I didn't owe him anything, but the memories crept in. I remembered the years of neglect, the constant feeling of being a burden, and the way he'd discarded me without a second thought. I knew that reconnecting would only reopen those wounds, and I couldn't allow myself to go back. I finished my finals, powered through the stress, and tried to focus on the things that mattered: my friends, my accomplishments, and my future. As winter break began, I packed up my things and headed to my grandparents' house, ready for some much-needed time with the people who'd become my true family. When I arrived, my grandparents greeted me with hugs and smiles, and it felt like coming home. We spent the first few days catching up, sharing stories, and settling back into a comforting routine. It was exactly what I needed after the whirlwind of my first semester, and I started to feel the tension from my dad's attempted reappearance melt away. Here, I was safe. A few days before Christmas, however, the peace was interrupted. My dad showed up at my grandparents' doorstep unannounced. I was upstairs, and my grandma came to get me, her face lined with worry as she explained that he'd come to talk things over. I felt a mix of anger and exhaustion. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want to risk being dragged back into his games, but I also knew that this might be the only chance to put things to rest once and for all. After taking a few deep breaths, I went downstairs. He was waiting in the living room, looking smaller and older than I remembered. Gone was the polished image he'd always presented, replaced by a man who seemed lost, almost desperate. Part of me felt a pang of pity, but I kept my guard up. I knew he was a master of manipulation and I couldn't afford to let my guard down. He started off with a quiet apology, saying he regretted how things had turned out. He spoke about his mistakes, how he'd been under a lot of pressure, and how he'd just wanted a fresh start after the divorce. He tried to frame everything as a series of misunderstandings, as if his choices had been beyond his control. He even went so far as to say that he wanted to make amends, to rebuild our relationship, but he never actually admitted the real issue. He didn't take responsibility for kicking me out, for treating me like a burden, for putting his pride above his child. I listened quietly, letting him finish, but I kept my expression neutral. When he finally ran out of words, I took a deep breath and said, "I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't change what happened. You chose to kick me out, to make me feel unwanted, and I can't just pretend that didn't happen. I have a family now, and I don't need you to be a part of it. His face twisted in frustration, and he started to protest, insisting that he'd done his best and that I was being ungrateful. But I didn't let him get any further. I told him that the only reason I'd come downstairs was to make it clear that I was done with him. I had a new life now, one that didn't involve his manipulation, guilt trips, or empty apologies. I told him I hoped he found peace in his own life, but that mine no longer included him. With that, I turned and left the room. My grandparents had been listening from the kitchen, and when I walked past them, they nodded in quiet support. I could hear him arguing with my grandpa, trying to plead his case, but my grandpa shut it down, reminding him that he was a guest and that if he couldn't respect my boundaries, he would need to leave. After a tense few minutes, I heard the front door close, and I knew he was finally gone. After that, my grandparents and I sat down together, and they reassured me that I'd done the right thing and that I was under no obligation to forgive him or let him back into my life. They reminded me that family was about love, respect, and trust, things he had failed to show me. For the first time, I felt a real sense of closure. I'd faced him, told him my truth, and held my ground. I didn't owe him anything more. The rest of winter break was peaceful. We celebrated Christmas together, laughing, sharing stories, and making new memories. I returned to college in January feeling lighter, like a weight had been lifted. My dad's shadow no longer loomed over me, and I felt truly free to embrace my new life. That semester, I threw myself into my studies, my friendships, and my job at the library. I felt stronger than ever, with a sense of purpose and clarity that I'd never known before. My grandparents continued to support me, cheering me on from afar, and I felt their love with me every step of the way. As I moved forward, I realized that my dad's choices no longer defined me. I was free to build my own legacy, to create a life filled with love and respect. I was determined to be the kind of person who valued family, not because of blood, but because of the kindness, loyalty, and understanding that real family provides. By the time summer came around, I'd fully embraced my new path. I looked back on the year with gratitude, knowing that despite the pain, it had led me to a place of strength and peace. My dad had tried to rewrite our story, but I'd reclaimed it, creating a narrative that was truly my own. And as I looked to the future, I knew I'd never allow anyone to take that from me again. As summer arrived, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. It was hard to believe how much my life had changed since I'd left my dad's house. A part of me still felt the echoes of his rejection, but the pain was distant now, like a memory from someone else's life. I was free, and for the first time, I felt like I was truly moving forward on my own terms. Over the break, I went back to my grandparents' house. They greeted me with open arms like they always did, and I immediately felt at home. We spent long evenings in the backyard talking about my plans and dreams for the future. I told them about my classes, the career path I was considering, and my goals. They listened with genuine interest, giving me advice when I asked and encouragement when I needed it. Their love and support had become the foundation I was building my life on, and I couldn't be more grateful. During one of these conversations, my grandpa told me he wanted to put some things in place for the future. Specifically, he wanted to make sure the family business would be in good hands. He asked if I'd ever considered taking it over someday. The question surprised me. I'd spent so much time distancing myself from my dad's shadow that I hadn't even thought about the family legacy. But as I listened to my grandpa talk about the business, the values he'd built it on, and his hopes for its future, I began to feel a sense of pride in it. He didn't pressure me. He just wanted to know if I'd be open to learning more, to see if it was something I could see myself doing. And for the first time, I felt that this legacy wasn't a burden. It was a gift, one that I could shape and make my own. I told him I'd love to learn, and he smiled, saying that we'd start whenever I was ready. Over the summer, he introduced me to the basics of the business, teaching me about its operations and values, about the importance of integrity, and about how it had always been a point of pride for the family. Unlike my dad, who had only ever seen the company as a status symbol, I began to see it as something meaningful, a testament to my grandpa's hard work and dedication. I realized that if I chose to take it on, I could honor his legacy while making it my own. Meantime, my dad's presence faded from my life. I didn't hear much about him, except for the occasional family update. From what I gathered, he was struggling, moving from one low-paying job to the next, trying to make ends meet. His pride had taken a hit, and he no longer had the comfortable life he'd always taken for granted. I felt a strange mixture of pity and detachment when I heard about him. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. I didn't wish him harm, but I didn't feel responsible for his situation either. By the time summer ended and I returned to college, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I'd gained clarity over the break, understanding that my past no longer defined me and that I had the power to build a life that reflected my values, not someone else's expectations. I returned to my studies with determination, driven by the realization that I was in control of my own destiny. The next few years were some of the best of my life. I continued to learn from my grandpa, absorbing everything he could teach me about the business and about life. He taught me the importance of hard work, of treating people with respect, and of building something with integrity. His influence shaped me, and I knew that when the time came, I'd be ready to carry on the family legacy in a way that honored his vision. My grandparents' unwavering support allowed me to thrive, and as I prepared to graduate, I felt a deep sense of pride in everything I'd accomplished. My dad's choices no longer haunted me. They were a distant memory, a reminder of a past that no longer held any power over me. I'd built a life rooted in resilience, kindness, and gratitude, values I'd learned from my grandparents who'd shown me what family was supposed to be. On graduation day, my grandparents were there, beaming with pride as they watched me walk across the stage. Afterward, we celebrated together, laughing and reminiscing about everything we'd been through. My grandpa pulled me aside and told me how proud he was, not just for graduating, but for the person I'd become. He said he knew I'd be an incredible leader, someone who could bring strength and compassion to the business, and he couldn't wait to see what I'd accomplish. I hugged him, feeling a swell of gratitude for everything he'd done for me. He'd given me more than just a place in the family business. He'd given me a sense of belonging, a foundation I could stand on, and the confidence to build a future I could be proud of. As I look back now, I realize that everything I went through, every hardship, every painful moment, had led me to where I am today. My dad's rejection had once felt like the end of the world, but now I see it as the turning point that brought me to my true family. It had opened the door to a life filled with love, purpose, and the chance to create a legacy that was truly mine. Moving forward, I'm determined to honor the lessons I've learned. I know there will be challenges, but I also know that I have the strength to overcome them. I'm proud of the person I've become, and I'm grateful to have a family who supports me unconditionally. My life isn't defined by my past, but by the choices I've made to rise above it. And as I step into the future, I know that I'm ready to carry on the legacy my grandparents have entrusted to me, with all the respect and integrity they've taught me to cherish. Thank you to everyone who followed this journey. The road hasn't always been easy, but it's led me to a place of peace and purpose. Here's to building a life filled with love, resilience, and gratitude. A life that, in the end, was worth every step of the way. Story 2. Okay, so this is how it all began. I'm 41 years old, a single father, and I'm just trying to make ends meet and be a good father to my 16-year-old daughter. We have always had a close relationship. I thought so anyway. I've been trying my best to support her, organizing movie evenings and assisting her with school-related tasks. Simply being a reliable person. Everything was rather typical, or as typical as possible, bringing up an adolescent. My daughter asks her friend C whether she may stay over one evening. I didn't give it much thought. After a year or so, C and my daughter appeared to be inseparable. They engage in all the typical activities of adolescent girls, such as watching movies, ordering excessive amounts of pizza, and talking loudly into the morning. I assumed it would be another typical sleepover. When they arrived, everything appeared to be in order. They chose a movie I didn't know, we ordered pizza, and they got comfortable for the evening. I didn't anticipate seeing them until the morning, so I went to bed at midnight. However, I got up to use the restroom a few hours later. My room is only a short walk down the hall because my house is small. I decided to go back to sleep and call it a day. When I opened the bathroom door to return to my room, however, I saw C waiting for me in the hallway. I wasn't comfortable with the expression in her eyes. Too strong. You are aware. I assumed she simply needed to use the restroom, so I tried to move more quickly and remarked, "Hey, it's all yours." But she lunged. There is no other way for me to explain it. Suddenly, she leaned in as if to plant a kiss on my lips. For a little while, it seemed as though my mind was unable to comprehend what was happening. In the middle of the night, this child, who happens to be my daughter's friend, is virtually hurling herself at me. In order to avoid awkwardness, I tried to keep things light and pulled back, laughing it off. "Whoa, hey, I think you've got the wrong guy," I remarked. She appeared quite ashamed. My kid kind of muttered something I couldn't understand before turning around and returning to her room. For a moment, I just stood there trying to process what had just transpired. Ultimately, though, I dismissed it. I assumed it had nothing to do with her. She was just a child acting impulsively and awkwardly. I dismissed it as the quirkiness of adolescence and went back to sleep, believing it was over. I didn't give it another thought for a few days. Then, without warning, the cops phoned me. They said I had to come in so they could question me. Initially, I believed that there might have been an error of some kind, as if they had chosen the wrong man, or perhaps it had to do with something else. But I knew it was horrible as soon as I stepped down there. The detective's expression said it all. He begins by telling me that I was accused of violating C. My entire world seemed to be whirling. I recall simply sitting there and gazing at him, unable to comprehend a word I was hearing. This must be a joke or some miscommunication, I thought repeatedly. They simply kept staring at me with that same attitude, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake or confess to something I hadn't done. I tried to explain what had really happened, that there was nothing to it, and that I had turned her down. I reviewed everything several times. She attempted to kiss me in the corridor, but I laughed it off and went to bed. But like they were searching for flaws, they persisted in pressing, requesting specifics and challenging everything I offered. They were acting as though I had already been found guilty, even though I knew I was innocent. They then questioned me about why she would fabricate something like this. I had nothing to say. How could I have known? I couldn't explain why she would turn something so innocent into something terrible, and I had no idea what was going through her mind that evening. I did my best to remain composed, but the more they asked me questions, the more I felt like I was being held captive. As if they were using her word alone to construct a case against me. I left there in a total haze after they finally let me leave. I felt ill, as like I had no control over the way my life was falling apart. I knew the accusation would shatter everything, and it loomed over me. Everything seemed different when I returned home. I was exhausted. A million thoughts are racing through my head, and I was still in shock that this was really happening. Perhaps my daughter would see right through it, I reasoned. No, that isn't possible. I thought she knew me. However, I received nothing when I attempted to contact her. Radio silence. I eventually get a response from her after a day or two. But not in the manner I had anticipated. She interrupted me, blocked me on all social media platforms. To make matters worse, she just included one line in this message which read, "Believe women." That was it. Not much more. Only that single line. The pain I felt from that is beyond words, because my own daughter has essentially written me off to the world while I am defending myself against these baseless claims. But I didn't give up. I tried contacting her, texting her, and even going to her mum's house to visit her, but my ex wouldn't let me in. The way she's blocking the doorway makes me look like a criminal. She wasn't talking much, but I could tell by the look in her eyes. She also thought so. It felt like a stomach punch. I used to share my life with this woman. My child's mother was staring at me as if I were a monster. Then the brother of my ex. This man, who has consistently behaved as though he harbors resentment toward me, chooses to act independently. He appears out of nowhere. Shouting for me to get lost, he pushes me away from the door. Referring to me by name, as well as when I attempted to defend myself. I tried to explain that I would wait to leave until I saw my daughter. He struck me square in the face. One solid blow. I was on the ground as well. I could only hear him yelling at me to keep away. I'm now sitting outside my ex's house, ashamed and bleeding. How did things get so fouled up, I wonder? It seems as though everything changed suddenly. Only a few days ago, I was a typical father who would do anything for his child. Everyone doesn't trust me, the person that everyone believes to be a predator. I had no idea what to do at that time. My daughter had left. Her mother didn't want to interact with me. Even my own pals began behaving strangely around me. This accusation seems to have stuck with me, regardless of how untrue it was. Not having my baby was the worst part. That was the most painful thing. She refused to see me, speak to me, listen to me. Nothing. Then it dawned on me. To her, I was no longer her father. This is all I was. She didn't want anything to do with this person. As the days passed, the cops persisted in calling me in and asking the same questions, seemingly anticipating my next mistake. I was honest with them each and every time. However, each time I left, I felt as though I had lost a part of who I was. And it was hurting me every time I returned home to find my house vacant, knowing that my daughter viewed me as a monster. I didn't get much sleep. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, wondering how I'd ever handled this, wondering if my daughter would spread the word, and contemplating all the things others might be saying behind my back. Never in my life have I felt so isolated. I wanted to go to her and explain everything to her. Maybe I could convince her to see reason if I could only talk to her, I told myself repeatedly. However, each time I attempted to do so, I would recall the expression on her face as she prevented me. That expression of complete disdain. As if I were no longer the man who brought her up. It seemed as though she could no longer see me, merely removed with a single motion from her life. I had no choice except to wait and hope that the truth would eventually surface. But while I sat there by myself, everyone turned against me. It seemed as though that truth would never be revealed. It was difficult enough to be summoned in for interrogation once. However, it didn't end there. Every time I thought I had a clear explanation, they seemed to call me back with more questions. Every time I sat down and tried to remain composed, I honestly began to feel like a criminal entering that station. But I could see how the cops were watching me, as if they were just waiting for me to make a mistake. They would repeatedly ask questions, modifying the phrasing, interjecting inquiries into matters unrelated to the charge itself. They seemed to be merely trying to see whether I would break. The worst thing was that they would keep asking these absurd questions. For example, what did you do tonight? Why did you let her stay over things that gave me the impression that they weren't really listening to what I had to say, but rather were looking for something to use against me? How many ways can I tell you that nothing happened? I kept asking myself. The first time they made me sit there and make a statement is something I will always remember. I was given a piece of paper and instructed to write down all I could recall from that evening. Pen in hand, I'm sitting in this small room attempting to ascertain exactly what they want from me. How, after all, can you recall every little detail of a night that seemed quite regular at the time? Since nothing even occurred to me, there was no necessity for me to commit every small detail to memory. I wrote what I could. I repeated to them what I had said 100 times. I had gotten up, used the restroom, and then run in to see in the hallway. She made an attempt to kiss me. I rejected her, and that was that. I didn't think much of it, to be honest. A strange moment. Teenagers can be awkward at times. I shrugged. The police, however, didn't think so. I could witness their interactions. I guess they didn't trust me. And I became irritated. The most difficult questions followed. As if they were attempting to uncover some secret about me, they began to get personal, asking me why I was no longer married and why my kid was even staying at my house rather than her mother's. I had the unshakable impression that they had already determined I was guilty and were only waiting for me to make a mistake. They took out my daughter's statement at one point. Although I was unable to witness it myself, I was rather moved by their discussion about it. They insisted on stating that she trusted her friend and that she didn't think she would fabricate things. And she quickly sided against me, her own father, without even speaking to me first. and it was all I could think about, Dot. They kept reminding me that I was the bad guy here, as if they were twisting the knife. They even mentioned my former partner. According to them, your ex-wife also appeared to be fairly certain of this. In some way, that strengthened the accusation. We've been good co-parents, but I understand that divorces aren't always pleasant. I thought so anyway, now, though. It seemed like everyone was prepared to assume the worst. Every time I exited the station, I felt even more exhausted. I would feel as though I had been struck by a truck as I stepped out into the daylight. All of these questions were making my head spin. I was unable to respond, as if I had never come here in the first place, and I would feel sick every time they called to ask me to return. I kept thinking that perhaps they had already made the decision to blame me for this. Furthermore, nothing I said would persuade them otherwise. In addition, I was without my own child, my daughter, during this time. I had lost the one person in my life that I had hoped would support me, every day. I check my phone in the hopes that she has gotten in touch with me, or even just sent a message expressing uncertainty. However, nothing was present. She knew she would sooner believe her buddy than her own father, but she remained completely mute. More than anything the police could hurl at me, that hurt. They called me in one day and began displaying images to me, They seemed to be attempting to psych me out or something. They would display pictures and ask me to explain things that didn't relate, such as how my house was set up and how people sat at dinner, what we discussed that evening, or other seemingly unrelated topics. But they would keep a tight eye on me, as if they were deciphering every word, and they would wait for me to make a mistake, It was a whole mental exercise. I was aware that nothing had occurred and that I had done nothing improper. However, I began to doubt myself because of the manner they questioned me. I would caught myself wondering if I had made a mistake. Was there anything I said that seemed strange? That's the problem with these circumstances. Even when you know you're telling the truth, they play with your mind and cause you to doubt yourself. I didn't give up, though. I repeatedly gave them the same responses. Despite my fatigue, I felt as though I was trapped in a nightmare and couldn't get out of it. This charge, which had suddenly come to tear apart my life, was something I couldn't get rid of. And every night when I went home by myself, I would repeat everything I had spoken, every glance I got from the police. Each and every sigh, die. I felt bad just for being there because of that. The waiting was the next step. On certain days, I would leave the station and wait to see if I would be called back in, or if they had made the decision to arrest me. If they were speaking to my daughter once more, they would be giving her additional excuses to avoid them, Despite the fact that I had done nothing wrong, it seemed like I was on trial every single day. I had a pit in my stomach the entire time because I knew that I would lose everything, my daughter, my family, and my entire life, if I couldn't persuade them of my innocence. In retrospect, I'm still unsure of how I managed to get through it, at home. I would sit and look at the wall, wondering how one accusation could destroy everything. I hardly had time to comprehend how quickly my world had changed, and being aware of how fast everyone around me was passing judgment and ready to assume the worst. I wouldn't want anyone to experience that type of anguish. Thus, I was continuously entering that police station, confronting unbelievers, and returning home to a deserted house while questioning whether this nightmare would ever end. Therefore, the next blow didn't come from the police after all those rounds where they felt like I was always attempting to prove my innocence. Not at all. My own daughter was the source of this one, via her social media accounts. Even if I didn't immediately see it, I definitely heard about it. Before I even looked, I sensed that something was wrong when friends began phoning me and sending me messages. My heart just fell when I saw it at last. It was at the very top of her page. Have faith in women. Those two phrases alone appeared as an insignia of sorts. Without mentioning my name, I gave a slight indication to everyone who was following her that I was at fault, and that was all some people needed to see. Seeing your own children say something like that in front of the world has a certain effect, even if she did not explicitly state so. Everyone in our group understood her meaning. Family, companions, friendships. I was the one being accused and they all knew it, and witnessing my daughter share it. I was guilty, and it felt like the last straw for her. The narrative is over. To be honest, I spent far too much time staring at the post. As if it may make sense or change in some way if I looked closely enough. In its most basic form, it seemed like betrayal. More than anything else, though, it made me feel helpless and insignificant. I couldn't get through to her, failed to get her to pay attention. She then expressed her thoughts to everyone else. After that, there was no turning back. My phone started exploding up in a matter of hours. Family members messaged me to inquire about the situation and whether it was real. Suddenly, like they were watching a train crash, people I hadn't spoken to in years became interested in my life. Although some made an effort to be subtle, it was obvious. Everyone thought I had done it. Everyone knew someone who had seen it, whether they were friends, neighbours, or co-workers, and I felt as though my name was affixed to this enormous scarlet letter. Furthermore, I couldn't even defend myself. Anything I said would most likely come out as someone trying to hide their guilt. The cops also advised me to keep silent because everything is still being investigated. I can't speak a single word while I watch my life being torn apart online. Then the messages arrived. Some from total strangers. I'm being accused, referring to me by a variety of foul terms, describing me as a monster. Death threats were sent to me. I should rot in prison, they say. That I was the world's worst problem. I was receiving hateful paragraphs from them. I was forced to sit there helpless to protect myself. Meanwhile, my daughter continued to remain mute. Nothing straight from her. No texts, no calls. For everyone to see, only that post. And it remained there each time I visited her page, with supportive comments pouring in. You're very courageous, they said. You're acting appropriately. No one took the time to consider the possibility that I wasn't guilty. That I might be the one speaking the truth after all. The folks I believed to be friends vanished. Some made contact, most likely merely to pique their interest. They obviously didn't believe me either, though. I'd known one of my best friends for years and they didn't even bother to call. I hope it's not true, man, was the only message he sent. I hope it's untrue. That was all he said. In just a few days, it seemed like everyone I had ever trusted had either disappeared or turned against me. Also, my daughter's post remained active. I kept expecting that she would remove it, that perhaps she would change her mind, or that someone would reason with her. I was intended to be a monster, but it merely remained there like a sign, reminding everyone who followed her. I even thought about posting something myself one day. I sent a lengthy, irate letter defending myself and expressing how painful it was to be condemned without evidence. However, every time I looked at it, I considered how other people could see it. They might see it as an angry man attempting to threaten his daughter or as damage control. Nothing I said would be heard. They would misrepresent it, giving the impression that I was attempting to guilt-trip her or coerce her into keeping quiet. I then erased it and sat there feeling absolutely powerless. I was unable to move without feeling the weight of that post in the days that followed. People who were aware of it would avoid eye contact or simply gaze at me, obviously unsure if they were staring at a criminal. At work, others also started acting strangely around me, as if they were at a loss for words. Moreover, I began to be shunned by a few of my neighbours. When I waved, they would act as though I hadn't seen them and would quickly return to their houses as if I were ill. Every day, I would check her profile in the hopes that she had removed it, but she hadn't, T. And more individuals joined in the longer it lasted. It became this focal point. Her courage in speaking up or declaring that she was taking a stand was praised by others. Telling them that she hadn't spoken to me made me want to shout, hadn't even made an effort to listen to me. However, I was aware that it would only make matters worse. I seemed more guilty the longer I remained silent. However, saying anything would exacerbate the situation. So I was just trapped. There was nothing I could do but watch my reputation burn. I was portrayed as a predator by my own daughter, and the rest of the world was consuming it like a twisted drama. And what should I have done? On certain evenings, I would lie awake trying to think of something to say to her about how much this was ruining me. However, I would later recall that she wasn't responding to it. She probably wouldn't listen, even if I managed to reach her. She had already made up her mind about who I was. What's the worst? The others had to. I formerly believed that social media was merely a place to connect with others, exchange pictures and occasionally chuckle at dumb memes. I had no idea that it would be the thing that destroyed my life. I was now witnessing my own daughter's post drag my name through the mud while people applauded her without realizing the truth. No one gave a damn, and I was officially alone. The day eventually arrived when I received another call from the investigator after weeks of living in a nightmare and again responding to the same questions. But he didn't sound like he was prepared to leave this time. With me, another round. Something had changed in his voice. Something like, "I'm not sure. Be cautious." They had news on the case, so he invited me to come down to the station. I was no longer sure what to anticipate at this point. It was just more of the same. I thought more accusations, more questions, more waiting around as they dissected my account, as if I had done something incorrectly. However, I entered, took a seat, and waited. After giving me a long look, the detective leaned forward as if to get me ready for his next statement. "We've been re-interviewed," he continued, clearing his throat. "You see, her tale has been altered." I was struck hard by their words. At first, I assumed that things were going to become worse, and that she had somehow managed to make things worse. Then he continued. He clarified that they had been pressuring her for additional information, something concrete to support her charge, and it seems that the numbers didn't add up. They had begun to notice irregularities, details she couldn't keep straight, and things she had previously omitted. Additionally, she started to falter and retrace some of her account when they pressed her on it. She had been agitated, he said, was unable to maintain the timeline, was unable to recall what she had previously told them. They initially assumed she was merely nervous, but the more they pushed, the more unsteady she became. He went on to say that they had noticed something. Her whole tale was beginning to unravel. They insisted that she provide them with a single, coherent account of what had happened. Each time she made an attempt, she would make a mistake or say something different. She finally froze and fell silent. At that point, they leaned in close to her. They put pressure on her, according to the detective, reminded her that telling the truth was crucial and that what she was saying was serious. That quote when she lost it. The detective claimed that woman sobbed and acknowledged that it was all untrue, that I had not harmed her in any way. She admitted that her mum's lover was the true reason she had blamed me. She couldn't bring herself to accuse him explicitly, even though he was the one who had caused her pain. She feared him, felt stuck and unsure about how to go. Since I wasn't a major part of her life, she claimed that blaming me had seemed simpler and safer in some way. I didn't experience the relief I had been hoping for when I heard those words. I experienced an uncontrollable flood of hurt, rage, and frustration. All of this suffering, the restless nights, and the way my own daughter had betrayed me. It was all because I was the most convenient person to assign blame on. She didn't want to confront the true monster in her life, so she totally upended my life. The detective continued by saying that the investigation was being closed and my name was being officially cleared. I was off the hook legally. I wouldn't be taken into custody. I wouldn't have to be concerned about charges looming large. But as he talked, everything seemed so pointless. Yes, I was considered to be in the clear by the law, but what about the rest of it? My relationships, trust, reputation, and even my own daughter had all been destroyed. That was all still in ruins. Everything I cared about had already been torn apart, regardless of how much the detective wanted to tell me that I was free. I hardly recall getting out of the station. I must have been in a fog when I drove home. I tried to make sense of everything by mentally repeating what the detective had said. I was so numb that I just sat on the couch and stared at the wall when I arrived home. Even if the truth had finally out, nothing had changed. I kept thinking about how quickly she had ruined my life because it was simpler for her, and how readily she had made me her scapegoat. What's the worst? Without hesitation or concern for the damage she was causing, she had carried out the action. As if I were guilty, I thought about my daughter and how swiftly she had fallen for the deception, shut me out, and wrote about believing women, certainly for the days that followed. This sense of nothingness persisted in my mind. Although the charge had been dropped, the harm had already been done. Everyone who had previously supported me, including friends and relatives, had treated me like a monster. They wanted me to simply pick myself up and continue as if nothing had occurred after forcing me into this terrible seclusion. Naturally, calls then began to come in, primarily from family members and those who had been avoiding me for weeks but now wanted to communicate. However, I simply wasn't feeling it. I was unable to get rid of the emptiness and resentment. However, my daughter sent me the one message that truly affected me. Her voicemail was lengthy. I instantly gazed at my phone as soon as I saw it. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear it. At that moment, I wanted to remove it. When she posted the Believe Women stuff, she had said all she needed to say. Her dedication was evident to me at that moment. However, the dad side of me wanted to give her a chance. I suppose a part of me still wished she had an explanation to help make sense of this whole situation. Her voice sounded uncertain and unsteady as I pushed play. She began with her father. "I apologize." I immediately experienced that lance of pain once more. "Apologies." She apologized. The weeks of torment I endured were meant to be covered by that. However, I continued to listen. She talked about how she was her best friend, despite the fact that every phrase was like salt on a wound. She felt compelled to believe her because of how close they were. She remarked, "I didn't think anyone, especially someone I trusted so much, would lie about something like that." By the end of it, I could hear her crying and her voice breaking. She was talking about how she had been afraid and perplexed, how she missed me, and how she now felt bad. I wish I could claim that it improved my mood. I wish I could say that all of the hurt and rage I had been harboring vanished when I heard her apologize. However, it didn't. The only thing on my mind was how quickly she had thrown me under the bus. There was no hesitancy, no. "Can we discuss, Dad?" Nothing. She immediately condemned me after hearing one accusation. Portraying me as the villain in the tale. At the end of her message, she expressed her desire to visit and have a face-to-face conversation. She claimed that in order to put things right, she needed to see me. She apologized repeatedly, as if that would make everything better. However, it only made me feel more empty. I was not satisfied when I heard her voice and realized that she was in pain. She had already determined my guilt before anyone had had a chance to look into it, so it didn't change anything. I just stared at her name and my contacts while sitting on the couch that night with my phone in my hand. I kept questioning myself if I ought to give her a chance, invite her around, and give her an opportunity to explain herself. However, I felt this wall rise each time I considered it. My own child's unreserved judgment of me was a betrayal that I couldn't get over. And now, after everything was over, she desired to speak. Someone knocked on my door at about 8 o'clock. I didn't even need to make sure. I recognized her. All day long she had been texting me to say she was on her way and to ask me to let her in. However, I couldn't bring myself to respond when I heard her begging voice on the other side of the door. I just sat there with a mixture of despair and rage. For a long she remained outside, shouting my name and banging. Through the door I could hear her saying, "Please, Dad, I need to talk to you." But I was unable to do it. I wanted to open the door and give her a hug, assure her that everything would be all right and forgive her. But then I would go back on all the times I was by myself, knowing that she had decided to think the worst of me. I felt as though I had to choose between being her father and being a complete stranger. I wasn't sure which one I should be because she had injured me. She eventually left, and I hoped that would be the last of it. However, the texts continued to arrive. She apologized profusely via text, saying she was shocked by what she had done. She was terribly sorry. How she had to correct the situation. I also wanted to think she was real, to think she was really remorseful. However, how could I simply delete everything? It wasn't merely an error. She had repeatedly made the same choice for weeks. She had blocked me and disregarded me. She even openly expressed her unquestioning belief in her friend's accusation. She now desired a fresh start. I couldn't see how she could expect that, much less ask for it. "Dad, please don't hate me," she wrote in one of her messages. And I wasn't prepared for how hard that affected me. In all honesty, I don't despise her. I was never able to. She is my child. I still adore her despite the fact that she broke my heart. That was the original cause of the intense pain. It would have been simpler to move on from her if she had been a random individual. However, she was my daughter Dot, the one person in the world I believed would always be there for me. Many evenings were spent contemplating if I should forgive her and whether I could allow her to return to my life without experiencing the ongoing pain of betrayal. However, each time I considered it, I would recall the expression on her face as she blocked me. When she stated that she didn't want to converse, her voice sounded frigid. My memory was etched with such memories. Furthermore, no amount of apology seemed to be enough to dispel them. I simply said nothing. When she called, I couldn't bring myself to answer her texts or answer the phone. I wasn't sure whether I'd ever be prepared to talk to her about letting her back in. I needed time and space to think things through without feeling pressured to forgive her immediately. I'm aware that doing so could paint me in a negative light, as if I'm being too severe. But I felt that after everything I had gone through, I should take a break and regroup before jumping into a forgiveness I wasn't prepared for. She had already moved on and thought that her apology had fulfilled her obligation. However, the harm was still new to me. I ended up sending her a little message. I let her know that I needed room, said I would get in touch with her when I was ready, but that I couldn't see her at the moment. It was the truth, even though I knew it probably upset her and wasn't the response she was looking for. I was not prepared to reopen that door. Not quite yet. And perhaps, just possibly, that was okay. I assumed that things would settle down, at least temporarily, after I told my daughter that I needed some distance. I reasoned that by taking a break from worrying about the betrayal, I would have time to process and clear my thoughts. However, that calm only lasted for a day or so before the family began sending out messages, calls, and texts. Once more, my mother was the first to do it. Particularly when it comes to family matters, she has never been one to keep silent. She told me over the phone that she had heard everything and was quite concerned about me. I understand, I do, but as soon as I answered, I realized she was calling more to persuade me to forgive my daughter than to see how I was doing. She kept claiming that she was young and that you know how teens are. She was wrong. I attempted to clarify to her that this was not a minor indiscretion that had caused my daughter to ruin my reputation, drag me through the dirt, and then abandon me to pick up the pieces. My mother, however, wouldn't have it. But she's your daughter, she persisted. As if that were enough to clear her mind of everything. No matter what, family always forgives family. My sister then went in. We've always been close, even though she's a little younger than me. However, she also sided with my daughter. Although she didn't say it out loud, it was rather clear from her texts. She would write me lengthy texts, expressing how difficult this must be for my daughter, how bad she feels, and how I must act like the grown-up larger individual. She was the one who made fun of me. But despite my repeated attempts to clarify, my sister continued to bring up the same issue. She is young. She felt afraid. I felt like screaming. Everyone pretended that I was the one who was going overboard, as if she were my child, and I should have put all of my hurt and rage aside. My sister even had the audacity to warn that you might lose her forever if you didn't forgive her. Have you lost her? It was she who abandoned me, blocked me, publicly stated that I was guilty before I had a chance to present my case. I'm just meant to allow her back in without question now that she's feeling bad. The following day, my mother gave me another call and attempted a different strategy. She continued by saying that our family is all we have and that this is an opportunity to teach my daughter. I'm still working on feeling like myself. I'm still dealing with the psychological wounds from everything. And she's behaving as though my child is learning a valuable lesson. Everyone seemed to view this as a chance for her to learn, and a small annoyance for me. Then there was my former spouse. I was actually okay with the fact that I hadn't heard from her personally since this began, but all of a sudden she was destroying my phone as well. We need to get together as a family and figure this out, she said in her voicemail. Yes, as if it were that simple. She also made the decision to accept the claims without inquiry, which is why I ended up in this situation. She ignored everything I said and refused to let me into the house. She now believes that we can resolve the issue by just holding a family meeting. To be honest, I thought I was going crazy when I heard everyone banding together against me in that way. Everybody around me was acting as though I was the one dragging things out, as if I should simply go on. But I was still carrying all of this hurt and resentment. They continued saying things like, "She's just a child and didn't know any better." But I didn't accept that as an explanation. She was sufficiently aware to blame me without hesitation on social media. She was aware enough to interrupt me. "Don't block me. Keep me out." At the time, she was aware of her actions. Now that it's finished, though, everyone is acting as though she is innocent. Even my aunt became involved. She's always been one of those peace at any cost sorts, but I think she means well. She wrote me a lengthy email in which she stressed the value of family healing and the need for me to lead by example in forgiving others. To be honest, I felt ill after reading that email. She continued to say things like, "Forgiveness is strength," and other things that seemed more like a catchphrase than practical guidance. They all didn't want to know what I had experienced. To make things easier for everyone else, they simply wanted me to forget and forgive. I finally had enough of this after a week. I told my parents and sister that I needed space in our family group chat. "I know you're worried about my daughter, but you have to realize that I'm also hurt," I added. "I can't ignore this for a day. Perhaps they would appreciate that," I reasoned. Perhaps they would back off and allow me the space I needed to process my emotions. However, not at all. My mother suddenly went on the attack, telling me that harboring resentment would only cause me more harm down the road. Her constant emphasis on the need for me to set a good example only made me feel worse. I didn't harbor resentment. All I wanted was to recover. Attempting to handle everything that had transpired. However, they gave the impression that I was being obstinate or petty. My sister then interrupted, stating that I should consider the long-term consequences and the possibility that I may come to regret shoving my daughter away. They repeatedly warned me that I would lose her if I didn't forgive her, as if they had all practiced the same script. Now, right now. Nobody took the time to consider what I had already lost, what she had caused me to go through, and what it was like to be totally alone in this. They still managed to reach me even after I muted the group chat for a few days in an attempt to gain some calm. One evening, my mother stopped by the house and simply appeared at my door as if she were paying me a quick visit. After she sat me down, she talked to me about letting go of my anger. She even claimed that forgiving her would make you feel a lot better. Perhaps she is correct. Perhaps one day it would feel lovely to forgive. Not just now, though. Not while everything is still so uncooked. That evening my aunt called to let me know that everyone was concerned about me. Telling her again and again that I simply wanted space made me feel like a broken record. "Don't let this split the family apart," she insisted. "Dismantle the family." The moment they all thought I was guilty, the family had already disintegrated. Just because they were feeling bad now didn't mean I had to fix the harm that had already been done. I was simply exhausted at the end of the week. "I'm sick of having to explain myself. I quote, am sick of defending my emotions. I'm sick of everyone bringing up the idea that I should be the greater person." I couldn't stop thinking about how, when the accusations initially surfaced, none of them had even given me a chance. All of them had been expecting the worst, similar to what my kid did. However, they now wanted me to make things simpler for them by fixing them. I ultimately made the decision to maintain my boundaries. I informed them that I wasn't prepared, that they needed to understand that I had no idea when I would be. It was difficult, to be honest. Retaliating against my own family, whom I had always trusted, was difficult. However, I was aware that I would only be carrying much more pain if I gave in now and forgave before I was ready. Perhaps I'll feel differently in the future. I might be able to open the door once more in the future, but I simply need a little time for now. And perhaps they never truly understood me at all if they are unable to comprehend it. I understood that I couldn't stay here after everything. I saw reminders of my past experiences everywhere I looked. The treachery, the judgment, and the friends and family that abandoned me without hesitation. I came to the conclusion that leaving everything behind was the only way to genuinely go forward. I so decided to sell my home, move far away and pack up. I know I need a new beginning, but I'm not sure where I'm headed yet. A fresh start where I can breathe at last. As challenging as it was, I shut off my family, including my daughter Dot, all those who betrayed me. I realized how little they cared about me during this entire horror, the ease with which they assumed the worst, almost without a query. I waited for weeks in the hopes that they would get in touch, that I would have support from someone. However, they didn't. And now that we know the truth, all of a sudden they wish to set things right, as if a few words of apology could make up for the suffering I endured. I can't act like this didn't happen, though. I can't simply pick myself up as if nothing had happened. Perhaps this new location will give me the opportunity to create something better. Perhaps I will even come across those who will truly support me. I can rely on them to accept me for who I am, not the person people think I might be. Although I have no idea what the future may bring, I am certain that I cannot spend it with people who view me as expendable. Those that left me when I needed them the most are gone from my life. So, yes, that's all. A fresh start. Very few people disappointed me. I'm prepared to discover a location where I can at last feel at peace again, even though it's frightening.